to Mark, the 9th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus and the disciples went on and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Have you ever been a part of ending a conversation? Now, I'm sure some of you who are teachers or work in a school know what I'm talking about, where there's a group of people who are talking about, something, and when they see you approach, their conversation stops immediately. As a pastor, I have this magic ability to end conversations just by showing up. It can really happen anywhere. I know, it might be even here at the church. Could be a group of people gathered or working, and here I come around the corner, and all I hear is, "Oh, pastor's here!" Which I know is code word for "be quiet." This has happened to me in local pubs and restaurants as well, where I might walk in and all eyes look up and all mouths begin to close. And like I said, I know this happens in schools where students are sitting around and talking, and as soon as the teacher walks in, suddenly things get very quiet. So in some contexts, if this were to happen to you, it could mean that the group is talking about you, which of course is unfortunate. In some contexts, then, this could also mean that this group of people was talking about something that they don't want you to hear. Something that they may not be proud of talking about. Something they know they shouldn't be talking about. Well, guess what? The disciples did it too. When they reached Capernaum, Jesus asked his disciples, "What were you arguing about on the way?" And how did they answer? They didn't answer. It said they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. So for these disciples, this was not some naive conversation that they were having where they were going to ask Jesus later who was the greatest, and Jesus was going to explain all of this to them. No, they knew that Jesus would not approve of this conversation and this question that they were wondering about. So when Jesus confronts them, they sheepishly grew quiet. They won't answer his question. They've been trapped in their thinking. So I was thinking that one of the things that we can learn from this is, first off, that there was nothing wrong with that question. Who is the greatest? Because as we hear, Jesus went on to explain to them who indeed is the greatest and how to become the greatest. So from that fact, the disciples really did not have anything to be embarrassed about. What they were to be embarrassed about was how they were thinking about what it takes to be great. So here's my question. If they knew that Jesus would not be pleased about this argument that they were having on the way, why were they even talking about it in the first place? Right? Fair question. I was thinking that those disciples could really take a lesson from all of us We have something to teach them, right? You should never say anything that you wouldn't want to say in front of your teacher or your pastor or... All right. Guilty, right? Bet every single one of us here, at one point or another in your life, in our lifetime, has been guilty of saying something like that. I know I've talked about things that I probably want to talk about in front of my pastor. Haven't we heard and learned, what's that saying? If you can't say anything nice,
Don't say anything at all.
no, I thought it was make sure the other person can't hear you. No, you're right, of course. If you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. But I'm getting off topic here. It was not that these disciples were not saying anything not nice, but more so they were saying something that was not true. What does it mean, then, to be great? We hear about being great in so many places in this world, right? And they heard it in the children's sermon. We hear about sports figures who are the greatest. And I think they even talk about them as a GOAT, G-O-A-T, greatest of all time. What does that mean? Does it mean you have the most talent or the most wins or the most money accrued? With actors or musicians, greatness comes in the number of box office hits or platinum albums or fans in their fan club. And so I don't think any of us here are award-winning platinum artists yet. So what does it mean for us then when we want to be the greatest in what we do and in our jobs and careers? Is it moving to the top of the ranks or bringing in the most income or owning the most land or equipment? What does it mean for me when I want to have the greatest sermon yet? Or be the greatest pastor who has more butts in the pews and more bucks in the plates than anyone else? That's how we measure, right? What does it mean that we want to be the greatest country on earth? What does it mean to be great? Well, Jesus tells us, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. And this is why the disciples are confused. And this is why we get confused. Jesus was teaching those disciples that he would be betrayed and killed. We heard that in last week's gospel story, the same thing, not long before this gospel story, where Peter was hearing this about Jesus and rebukes Jesus for that, and Jesus rebukes him for not understanding what it means to be great. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. So Jesus, their rabbi, their teacher, their soon-to-be Messiah and Savior, must suffer and die? Man, it just seems like good guys always finish last, right? Well, yeah. That's the point, I think, according to Jesus. And while I really dislike boiling heavy theology down into simple cliches, I really feel like this is what Jesus is pointing us to. Greatness is not what we think it is. Or actually, what I should say is that greatness is not what we want it to be. If we've been following Jesus for even just a little while, or if we've been coming to church for, even just a week or two in our life, we know that this is one of the biggest teachings of Jesus. Jesus calls us to lay down our lives, pick up our cross, put away those desires of being first, stop all the talk of winning or being the best. I know that we know that, but I don't think we like it. That's why we talk about the way we do like things to be in hushed voices or behind closed doors so that someone we respect or someone like a teacher or a preacher or Jesus doesn't hear what we really are saying. That's why we can come to church and plead for forgiveness and mercy from God and then walk out the doors and say, phew, glad that's done for another week. Being great in the way that the world speaks of being great is much more desirable than what Jesus is calling us to. I mean, really, who does not want more money? Who doesn't dream of hitting it big in the lottery? Because I know, of course, you're going to give that first 10% to the church, right? I mean, who doesn't dream of winning a gold medal in a sport or activity that you invest so much of your time into? Who does not dream of living in the best place on earth? Who doesn't dream of having something just a little nicer than what we already do have? I mean, you know as well as I do that we have been taught to think like this. All of human history has taught us to think like this. Which is why Jesus has to take a child and put this child in the middle of that crowd and say to them, when you welcome this child, you welcome God. And this scene of bringing this child in to make a point isn't just some cutesy little Sunday school poster-worthy event that happened here. I mean, this was radical. Children were not welcomed in this culture. They were not welcomed into crowds of adults, and they certainly were not welcomed anywhere that Jesus would be, because he is too important for this. So when Jesus brings this child forth, the disciples aren't going, oh, that's cute. They're thinking, what in the world is this kid doing here? And why is Jesus bringing him along? I mean, all of Jesus' teachings are meant to upset the balance of this world. All of Jesus' teachings were meant to upend our understanding of how we live in this world. I mean, think about it. Think about a world where every single person is trying to be number one, where they're trying to come out on top and trying to be better than anyone else, no matter what it takes. Could you even imagine that? Then think about a world where every single person wants what's best for everyone else, where every single person is welcomed, where every single person is cared for. Could you imagine that world? I mean, it's a world where no one would ever be inside a building because everyone's too busy holding doors open for everyone else. All right, not really. But you get the picture, right? When Jesus brings a child and places that child in the midst of us, it's less about him saying that we need to be more childish. I meant childlike. And more about welcoming those into the fold of our lives and into the fold of this world who are not currently welcome. It's about being great in the way that only Jesus can be great. It's about living as Jesus calls us to live. It's about living into and living for this great life that Jesus has already won for us. Thanks be to God. Amen.